Hi, and welcome to Whiteboard Tutorials from SDG Strategy. My name is Russ McGuire, the founder and chief strategist of SDG Strategy, and I welcome you to today's session. Today, we're going to be talking about scenario analysis. Now, scenario analysis is a great tool when you're dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty in your business. And right now, as we film this tutorial, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And I can't imagine another time in recent history where businesses have had to deal with more uncertainty than they are right now. So as we go through this tutorial, I want to give you a sense for how to use this tool. And specifically, I'm going to use an example. I'm going to use my own business as an example because just like everybody else, we are dealing with uncertainty. But I want to teach you how to use this tool, which could be helpful today in the midst of this crisis, or very well may also be likely in the future when you're dealing with uncertainty about other things, even beyond this current crisis. Now, the way in which scenario analysis helps when you're dealing with so much uncertainty is by taking the almost infinite number of possible future outcomes and simplifying them down to a small number of scenarios that you can really wrap your head around. Specifically, scenario analysis focuses on 4 scenarios. Will any one of those be the actual future that will play out? Probably not. But by doing planning around 4 different scenarios, you start to understand the range of options that you have. You start to understand the kind of variety of different outcomes and how they impact your business, and therefore how you have to plan for them, so that as the future actually does play out, you can draw upon the lessons that you've learned from those plans around those 4 scenarios and navigate your way through that uncertain future until there's greater clarity and you can set a plan around one future that is much more clear than what we have today. Okay, so enough talk and kind of leading up to it. How does scenario analysis play out? Well, you might have already been kind of taking a peek at this list that I have on the right of 6 steps that are involved in doing scenario analysis. The first step is to prioritize your uncertainties. You probably have a long list of uncertainties as we do in our business today. So you have to narrow that down. You're going to narrow it down to 2. So you're going to pick the top 2 uncertainties. These are the 2 uncertainties that are most impacting your ability to plan for the future. These are the 2 that are probably keeping you up at night. And the 2 that if you could figure out these 2, a lot of other things will fall into place. So you take the top 2, and for each of those 2, you select 2 outcomes. Now there's probably a broad range of possible outcomes, but you pick 2 outcomes that are representative. I like to pick one that is kind of an optimistic view. In the best of all cases, this might be the outcome, realistic outcome that we could expect. And maybe a pessimistic view, what's kind of a worst case realistic scenario. So you pick those 2 outcomes for each of the 2 uncertainties that you're dealing with. And so if you've got 2 possible outcomes, you've got 2 different uncertainties, then that's what leads you to the 4 scenarios. Now, before we get there, I do like to look for each of those 2 possible outcomes for each uncertainty. I like to identify, roughly what's the likelihood of each of those coming out. Now, those 2 add up to 100%. In reality, as I said, there's a range of different possible outcomes, but you just take those 2. And out of those 2, what's the likelihood that the optimistic view will happen? What's the likelihood that the pessimistic view will happen? And so from that, then when you construct your 4 scenarios and you name those 4 scenarios so that you can easily reference them, then from that point, then you can take the likelihoods of each of the 2 options on each of the 2 different uncertainties, and out of that you can get the likelihood of each of the 4 scenarios playing out. So that will help you understand where should you really put the bulk of your effort. Once you've got them named and constructed, then you look at them and you start to write a narrative. You start to tell the story. How is this scenario different from this other scenario? How would it change in terms of who are the winners in the industry? Who are the losers in the industry? Who are the customers that we're likely to serve? What are the capabilities that we're likely to have that we might not have today? Just start to play out all the different aspects. What does that future look like? How does that likely play out? What are the steps that lead to that? What are some indicators that we can watch for that will let us know that that is the scenario that's playing out? What are some tests that we can start to construct and build to test the hypothesis that that might be a future that's playing out? So all of those turn into a narrative, a scenario narrative. And so you do that for each of the 4 different scenarios. And then you go off and you build your plans. You say, if this is the future that plays out, what is the plan that we would need to have in place? Now you can't execute on 4 different plans, but by building the plans and identifying these are the things that we would need to do under this scenario, then you can start to see, based on, somewhat on those likelihoods, what are the things that we should start working on now? What are the capabilities that we need to build? What are the customers we need to approach? What are the competitors we need to pay attention to? What are the tests that we need to start putting in place to find out which scenario really is playing out? And what are the kind of markers? What are the red flags that we need to watch for that will tell us what direction things are going? So you can start to build kind of a consensus plan, but not until you understand what the plans would look like for each of those 4 different scenarios. So that's the outline that we're going to follow as I go through this. And so now, as I said, this is the process, but to make it easier for you to understand how to do that, I want to take my own business through this process. Now, before stepping to the whiteboard, I've obviously done some homework, so I've got some notes in front of me that I'm going to be referencing. If you see my eyes wander, that's why. So what are the key uncertainties? Kind of step 1, what are the uncertainties that I'm dealing with within my business? As I said, right now it's May of 2020. We're in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Lockdowns are starting to end. Businesses are starting to restart. So there's some activity, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And probably, the first thing that is obvious is it's unclear how quickly the economy is going to recover. So how quickly is the economy going to recover? The second is, as I think about businesses, how strong is their need for strategic development? I think a lot of businesses are hoping that they can just continue on with the strategic plans that they had before any of this happened. And for some, maybe they can. But there are others that are saying that almost every organization is going to have to throw out their existing plan and come up with a new plan. And that means there's going to be a lot of strategic development, and there may be a need for a lot of help from people like me. The third uncertainty is what's going to happen to budgets. So if we have an economy that's in the tank, we've got companies that are declaring bankruptcy, that are big kind of stalwarts of the economy. They're declaring bankruptcy. Others are going through certainly cash crunches. So what is the budget for strategic consulting? That's a big uncertainty for my business. The fourth would be, there's going to be a lot of layoffs. There already have been a lot of layoffs, a record number of layoffs. And some of those people are being called back, but some of those people aren't. And so we're going to have a lot of really good, really smart people that used to be employed that are no longer employed. Some of those might be getting good severance packages. And so there may be people who've been in strategy roles at companies, maybe even at large consulting firms, who now are finding themselves underemployed or unemployed with time on their hands. And some of those might say, hey, now is the perfect time for me to launch my own strategy boutique consulting firm. So we may have, I may have kind of this surge of new competitors that are hungry to take work away from people like me. So I'll put that, will we have this emergence of boutique consultants? By the way, I'll mention that if you've watched the tutorial, the whiteboard tutorial that I did around situation assessment, then many of these are coming out of that, which is natural because in that process we identified uncertainties. And so I went back and I referenced that work that we had done as I developed this list. So emergence of new boutique consulting firms might be something that I need to track, and I just don't know whether that's going to happen or not. That's an uncertainty. The next one, before I get to the next one, I probably have to explain a little bit more about my business. I don't consider SDG Strategy to really be a strategy consulting firm. What I consider us to be is a strategic catalyst. And so that's a different model than your traditional strategy consulting. And I won't spend a lot of time kind of explaining all of it, but the short version is that a strategic consultant typically will bring in an army of people who will do a lot of the strategy development work. They'll take it on as a project, they'll manage that project, they'll create an output. Obviously, they'll involve people from their client firm, but they're creating that strategy output and they're delivering it to their client. The strategic the catalyst works differently. We are a catalyst. The strategy work is still owned by our clients, and we come in as a catalyst to accelerate that process and to make it work more effectively, to have better outcomes, more productive outcomes than it otherwise would have had without us coming in. And so we're more lean and mean. Oftentimes it's just me coming in and being involved. And our whole goal is to complete the process faster. So we typically come in and do a very fast engagement, and it's a very thorough engagement, but it costs a lot less. So the two main kind of obvious values to the customer are faster strategy development, then the second one is less expensive. But the third is just as important, which is that the ownership is held by the executives, our clients within the client firm. They own the strategy, they deeply understand it, it's theirs at the end of it. It's not something that's been handed to them by a consulting firm. So the next big uncertainty for me is this is a new model. What's the acceptance of that going to be? So the next is acceptance of the catalyst model. By the way, I realize that my handwriting is not the best. So as I post this on clearpurpose.media, what you'll see is underneath the video are actually slides, images of slides that will make this very readable. But as I talk through it, you might glance down, you might be watching the video on that page, and you might glance down and see this more easily read on the slides that will be provided as well. So what's another uncertainty that we have? Well, another uncertainty that I think that we have in general is in this time when the whole economy locked down, then work from home took off like crazy. The number of people who were working from home went from a relatively small percent, probably around less than 20%, to a very broad adoption. More than 50% of workers were working from home during the last 2 or 3 months. Now, will that continue? Will we continue to see broad adoption of work from home? So I'm going to put down here kind of the continued adoption of work from home as another uncertainty that's really going to impact our business and our opportunity. And then the last one that I'll put down here, again, needs a little bit of explanation before I put it down there. But one of the main tools that we use in our work as a strategic catalyst is what we call the Strategy Lab. It's a very quick process. It's typically 2 or 3 days long, where we come in, we work very closely with the leadership team, and we take them through a process that we facilitate, but it's really their engagement that's driving it, again, in our catalyst model. And on the back side of that, what you have is a strategy that's been rapidly developed, that's deeply understood, it's deeply bought into, there's very strong consensus, there's clarity, and there's the ability to really well communicate that strategic decision that's been made to the entire team. And so that strategy lab is a great process, but our desire would be to move from delivering that in person to doing it as a virtual strategy lab, using the same technology that people have been using for the last few months in a distributed work from home type of model. So another big question is, are people ready to accept a virtual strategy lab. So I'll put adoption of virtual strategy lab. So these are, I think I've got 7 here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different, uncertainties that are really impacting the future of my business, and that, in my mind I'm wrestling with, if we have different outcomes on these, it's going to have a pretty significant impact on my business. So as I go through this and I try to prioritize, what are the ones that are the biggest impact on the future of my business? What are the ones that are really I'm struggling with, that sometimes I lay in bed at night and I think, what's going to happen with this? As I look at these, really the 2 that jump out at me are this one, what's going to be the adoption level of the virtual strategy lab, and then the same thing, what's the acceptance of the Catalyst model? And many of these others really feed into those 2. As you've got questions about budget, as you've got questions about the acceptance of a distributed workforce model, then those certainly play into to these 2 questions. So I'm going to focus on these 2 uncertainties as the 2 uncertainties that are really going to shape the future of my company, and therefore that's what I'm going to use to create the scenarios that we're going to work with. So I'm going to leave this list up here because we're going to continue to reference it. We've prioritized the uncertainties. The top 2 are the Catalyst model and the virtual strategy lab. The next step is to pick 2 possible outcomes that are going to be used to build the scenarios for each of those. So I'm going to erase this list so we've got room to work. And so the next step is to come up with what are the 2 outcomes that I want to select. So if we think about it, I'm going to take the first one first, and let's just go with the strategic catalyst model. And there are 2 obvious outcomes that always belong on the list when we're dealing with one like this. As I said before, there's really a whole range. You can think of it as a variance of no acceptance to full acceptance. And so let's kind of get both of those endpoints on there. One is totally rejected. That given what's happening with the economy, given what's happening with companies, they might say there's no way that we're going to accept that strategic catalyst model. And so nobody adopts it. And given that that's my business, that would be a bad outcome, but it's one that belongs on the list of possible outcomes. We'll decide whether or not it's one of the 2 that we're going to use. And the second is that it fully displaces the traditional consulting model. I don't think that's likely. That's a bit of wishful thinking on my part, but it belongs on the list. Just as the first one isn't likely, they both belong on the list because they represent the 2 endpoints. I think what's more likely to happen is somewhere in between those 2. And so, we might think of it in terms of that the catalyst model may be accepted, but only by certain types of businesses. So maybe there are certain businesses that would adopt that model. Maybe they're more aggressive, maybe they're entrepreneurs, maybe they're technology companies, maybe they're in certain geographies, maybe they're certain sizes, maybe it's small or medium businesses. But let's just kind of generalize it as only certain businesses adopt this new model. And then another way in which we might fall in between these 2 is that the strategic catalyst model may be adopted, but maybe only for certain types of strategic decisions. So I'll say certain strategies. So maybe the strategic catalyst model is only adopted for product strategies, or maybe only adopted for investment portfolio strategy. I don't know. There could be, again, there's many different types of strategy engagements, but let's just generalize it as only for certain strategies. Now, we could flesh this list out in a lot of different ways, but for simplicity's sake, what I want to do is I want to say, let's kind of boil these two down and kind of come up with two possible outcomes. And I'd say that an optimistic view of the level of adoption of the strategic catalyst model might be that the strategic catalyst model becomes the preferred model for 10% of the opportunities that today a strategic consultant would be hired for. And then for a pessimistic view, let's just say that only 1% of those opportunities are what are selected. So we'll come back and we'll use this again, but let's repeat this process now for the virtual strategy lab. So if we say for the virtual strategy lab, what's the level of acceptance of that model or that tool? And again, we need to have on there, the same two kind of endpoints of it might be totally rejected. I hope not, but it might be. And if it is, that's okay. We can continue with the model that we're using today. The second, again, is that it fully displaces the traditional consulting model. So not only does it displace the in-person strategy labs that we've been doing, but it also displaces kind of the traditional consulting model. So these are the two endpoints. Again, I don't think either one of them is the likely one. They probably aren't realistic. Neither one of them is probably realistic. So let's think about what are some more realistic views. So another possible outcome, similar to how we thought about it this way, is that maybe strategy labs are accepted, but not virtual. And again, that wouldn't be a bad outcome for us, but it wouldn't be the outcome that I'd say that we're hoping for. We're hoping that we can serve many more customers by not having to spend time traveling, but instead spend time with the clients themselves. And selfishly, I'd rather not spend a lot of time away from home and on airplanes and in hotels. And then the other one that I would mention here that's a little bit different than some of what we had here, it's kind of like the certain businesses, is maybe only in certain industries. So maybe there's some industries that are more aggressive in terms of adopting a distributed workforce and a virtual workforce model that would be more likely to adopt the virtual strategy lab. So again, to simplify things, I want to do the same thing and say that, let's take these with a 10% and a 1%. So the optimistic view is that 10% of the time the virtual strategy lab is adopted and 1% of the time is the pessimistic view. So we've now gotten through these first two steps. The next step is to estimate the likelihood of each of these. So I'm gonna simplify this down a little bit and get rid of all of these. And just put the two that we're working with up here. So 10% adoption and 1% adoption, 10% adoption, and 1% adoption. So what is the likelihood of each of these two under this model? I'm going to switch colors here just so we can kind of keep track, because we've got some percentages here and I'm going to put some other percentages up here, but they mean something different. So how likely are we to have a 10% adoption of the strategic catalyst model displacing the traditional strategy consulting model? So I think that some of the things that are favoring this are the fact that you've got budget's constrained. And as I said, the strategic catalyst model is a less expensive model. So if people are struggling with the fact that their consulting budgets are constrained, if they buy into the strategic catalyst model, if they believe that that's a viable option, then this can help them to get more done with less money. And then similarly, right now, especially with this COVID-19 crisis going on, there's a sense of urgency. People need to figure out, if there really is this need to rethink your strategic plan, then that needs to be done quickly. So I think that the urgency that people are facing right now would favor a higher level of adoption. On the flip side, what would favor a lower level of adoption? Well, one thing I think is that there's a lot of fear out there. And I think that when people have a lot of fear, then that drives them back to kind of the traditional model. So I think that fear is an inhibitor to adopting, taking risks and trying new things. So that, I think, would favor a lower level of adoption. And I think another thing is that with the constrained budgets, with people spending less on consulting, then I think that the traditional consulting firms may be more aggressive with their pricing to try to capture some opportunities that otherwise they wouldn't get. And so I think that they may have some flexibility on pricing that might appeal to the decision makers who would like to go the traditional route, and with their budget constraints, if there's that pricing flexibility, then they might say, yeah, let's stick with the way we've always done it. So with this in mind, where do we end up with in terms of the percentages of each? Well, I'm going to go with that it's probably, I think that these are some pretty strong drivers. So I think that this is probably, I'm going to call this 70% likely that there will be, this isn't 100%, this is only 10%. So I think it's 70% likely that at least 10% of opportunities to do strategy development, that there would be a consideration of a strategic catalyst model. And that leaves 30% likely for the 10%, for the 1% adoption rate. Okay, so now let's move down here. On the virtual strategy lab, where do we stand? What do I think are the drivers that are going to drive us to either of these two outcomes? Well, I think that the first thing that we're certainly dealing with here is that we have we effectively, as an economy, have proven in this model, this operating model of people being distributed and connecting in via video conferencing, connecting in through collaborative working tools. And so I think that a lot of people are much more comfortable with that today than they were even 2 or 3 months ago. So I think that is a real driver of this. And then similarly, kind of going the next step, we've got a bunch of companies that are adopting the remote model. In fact, I've got here, let me grab it. So Gartner just completed some research, and according to Gartner, about 74% of businesses say that post-COVID-19, at least 5% of their employees will no longer be coming into the office. About 25% expect 10% of their employees will remain remote, and another 17% expect 20% will remain remote. And 4% expect 50% will remain remote, and even 2% expect more than 50%. We've had big companies like Twitter say, every employee can work from home from this point going forward. We've had big companies like, let's see, who are some of the others? Well, Facebook has this long-term plan for how they're going to do it. But even companies like Nationwide Insurance and Barclays Bank are really buying into this in a big way. By the way, that study was of CFOs. And so another study that Gartner had done said that CFOs were cutting their budgets for upgrades of their technology on site because that investment instead is being made to support distributed workers. There also are significant cuts being made on real estate. In fact, some of the companies that I looked at have decided that they're basically going to eliminate all of their remote locations. They're going to have their headquarters location, but otherwise their remote workers are going to be work from home. So there's a lot of adoption by companies of this remote model, and I think that's a real driver of this acceptance of a virtual strategy lab. But on the flip side, I think that when we think about that, percentages of employees that are going to be working from home or working remotely, I think the management teams are the least likely. So kind of a driver of a lower adoption rate is that the management teams are still going to be in the office, and they may want us to come in the office. And then I think another kind of driver of this is that distributed really is hard. To get it right, to get this distributed model to work and to work well, really is hard, and I think that companies are realizing that as well. Even though people are a lot more comfortable with the tools, to make it work as well as when you've got people in the same room, in the same building, in the same office, it's hard to get it to work well. And so I think that there may be some hesitancy to adopting a virtual process for a strategy making process. So I think that when I look at this, then I think it flips a little bit. And so I think that what we've got is that it's probably more 60% likely that we'd have a very low adoption rate of a virtual strategy lab, and a 40% likely that we'd have a higher, like a 10% adoption rate. Okay, so now we've got through step 3, and this has really laid the framework. I know that this is, we're dragging this on, but hopefully it's helpful to you. So now I'm going to take, and with all of this, I'm going to now build out the 4 scenarios that we're going to use for the rest of our process. So, simple 2x2 matrix. So across the top, what we'll use is the adoption of strategic catalyst. And down the y-axis, we'll have the adoption of a virtual strategy lab. And for each, we'll have the pessimistic view and the optimistic view. And so this gives us our 4 scenarios. If you've got a low adoption of virtual strategy lab and a low adoption of the strategic catalyst model, that's your kind of most pessimistic view. If you've got high adoption of each, then from our perspective, that's our most optimistic view. So I'm going to kind of move to this side to make it a little bit easier for you to see it. I'm not standing in front of it. So let's name each of these 4 scenarios. And naming it is a kind of it's a fun thing to do. But now, as you work as a team, as you reference it, as you're developing your plans, as you're talking to people about the different scenarios, having a simple, short name for that scenario, not the 1% scenario or 1% 10% scenario, that can get confusing. So what I've come up with as names for these are this one, where you've got low adoption of the strategic catalyst model. So now it's really the traditional consulting, the long-term engagement model that comes into play. and it's in person, it's not virtual. I'm calling this the hotel loyalty scenario. If this is what's going to play out, then I better sign up for all the hotel loyalty programs that are out there so I can get rewarded for the fact that I'm going to be spending a lot of time away from home and probably extended stays at certain hotels. Now, if we remember, this, we have 30% likelihood and 70% likelihood, and we've got 60% likelihood and 40% likelihood on each of these. So we take this 60% and 30%, and this one is 18% likely of our four scenarios. 30% times 60% gets us 18%. Now the second scenario is, again, we've got low adoption of the virtual strategy lab. We have high adoption of the strategic catalyst. And so this is a scenario where people are loving the strategic catalyst model, but they want to do it in person. So it's short engagements, but it's wherever the customer is. So I'm going to call this one the airport lounge scenario. So I'm less, it's less about extended stays in a given city, but it's going from city to city to city to city to repeat this virtual strategy lab, doing this strategic catalyst, this accelerated process of helping teams to rapidly develop well-developed, well-communicated strategies. So again, if we take the numbers here, this is our most likely scenario. So 60% times 70% gives us a 42% likelihood for this scenario out of the four. Continuing on, here we've got a relatively high level of adoption for the virtual strategy lab, which is great, but a low adoption of the strategic catalyst model. So how does that work? Well, it means that there's not a lot of adoption of the strategic catalyst, but when it's adopted, then the virtual strategy lab really comes into play. So that's good news. The bad news is that the scope of the opportunity isn't as great for SDG strategy as I would like. So in this case, as we'll get to when we talk a little bit more about kind of building out what that narrative is around that, is that I'm probably not going to invest in building custom tools. I'm going to use off-the-shelf tools. So I'm going to call this scenario zooming. I'm probably using a lot of off-the-shelf tools like Zoom. And again, if we take this is probably the least likely. You got 30% and 40%. So this is 12% likely. 30% times 40% gives us 12%. And then the last scenario, this is my best outcome. This is where people love the strategic catalyst model. It's widely adopted, relatively speaking, 10%. And they love the virtual strategy lab model. They love the fact that as their teams have become distributed, that they can continue to have the types of strategic development discussions and engagement that we bring to the table. And so I'm going to call this booming. In this case, our business is booming. We're doing what we love doing. We're helping people, and we're doing it as quickly and effectively and efficiently as we can. So this is about 28% likely. So this is the second most likely outcome, that's good news for me. So this lays out, these are our four scenarios. We've named the four scenarios. We've even identified how likely they are given our best guesses. This isn't pure science and pure math, but we know that there's decent likelihood for all of them, and therefore they're all worth looking at. But we can focus probably a little bit more on the two on the right. Okay, so now, stepping back over here, looking at my next step. So we've named the four scenarios. We've named the four scenarios. We've given them likelihoods. The next step is to create scenario narratives. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to give you a simplified view of this. Basically, you want to tell a story. I've been talking for a long time. I'm getting a little tired. You're probably getting tired of listening to me. So let me simplify this quite a bit. what I want to do is I want to take each of these 4 scenarios and just kind of draw out some of the key differences between them. So our 4 scenarios again were hotel loyalty, I'm just going to shorten that to hotel so that I can get all 4 of them across here. So we've got hotel loyalty, we've got airport lounge, we've got zooming, and we've got booming. So let's just look at some of the differences between these. So one of the things that we like to do is to think about, in each of these scenarios, who are the winners and who are the losers. So I'll put winners and losers. So who are the winners in this hotel scenario? Again, this is a low adoption rate of the Strategic Catalyst model, and it's a low adoption rate of the Virtual Strategy Lab model. So in this case, the winners are really kind of the big consulting firms. They keep doing what they've always done. They do it well. It serves them well. Sometimes it serves the customers well. And that's what the customers say that they're comfortable with in this scenario. And so they're the big winners. So who are the losers in this model? Well, it's catalysts. Like SDG Strategy, there are other catalysts, and there likely will be more catalysts as this model takes off. But in this scenario, customers pretty loudly say, you know what, we want people on site, and we aren't that comfortable with this different model. So the catalysts are the losers in this scenario. So what about the next scenario, the airport scenario? Who are the winners? Well, I think the catalysts are the winners. Those that can come in and implement the strategic catalyst model, the SDG strategy certainly, but I think there will be others that can do that. And so I think that they're winners here. And who are the losers? Well, not a surprise. I think that it's the big consulting firms. Again, remember we said that a win here, kind of the positive outcome, is only 10% of engagements make the shift to this model. So still 90% are being done in the traditional consulting manner. So it's not like they're going out of business or anything. They're going to have plenty of work to do, but they're probably losing some of the most important, some of the most impactful work that they have on their plate. So I'd call them, relatively speaking, the losers in this scenario. If we move on to the zooming model, again, what we have here is a case where there's a low adoption of the Strategic Catalyst model. Within that, there's a relatively high adoption of the Virtual Strategy Lab model. So that's good. It's better than the alternative. But I think that the big winners are probably still the big consultants. Because now we're talking about 99% of the work continues to be traditional consulting. And who are the losers here? Well, again, I think that it's the catalysts. Because, again, that model isn't being adopted. Now, if we get over to the booming scenario, it'd be easy just to take these and to bring them over. But I think that in this case, this is a little bit more in our wheelhouse. With SDG Strategy, I've got a long history of doing strategy consulting work, doing strategy development work inside of companies, doing it as a consultant or a catalyst, doing it in startup environments. But I also have a long history with technology, of developing technology, of patenting technology, of writing software, of building technology startups. And so part of my vision as I've launched SDG Strategy is to build the kind of tools that can make this virtual strategy lab really happen. And so I think that we're uniquely positioned for this scenario, where you've got a relatively high adoption of Strategic Catalyst, you've got a relatively high adoption of this virtual strategy lab model. And so I think that really plays in where we're the big winners. And so the losers here are both the big and the new boutique consultants. And I think some of those boutique consultants will adopt a catalyst model because it works well when you've got smart people that aren't bringing on armies of people but can go in and have a big impact with a client. So from a winners and losers perspective, that gives us a picture for the differences between them. What are some other things that are probably important to think about as we start to build this narrative? Now you probably want to start turning this into paragraphs and pages of words, maybe a page or two for each of these. But just to give you a sense for the way that you'd think about it as you start to build that. Another thing that I think is really important is to think about customers. So how would we, as SDG Strategy, as we looked at these 4 different scenarios, how would we think about the customers that we go after differently? Well, if what we have is the hotel model where there's a relatively low adoption of the Strategic Catalyst model, there's a relatively low adoption of the Virtual Strategy Lab model, then I think what we need to do is we need to zoom in, to narrow in on what are the niches. Remember when I was setting this up, there may be industries that really do adopt these things. There may be specific types of opportunities that are a perfect fit for this. And so that 1% that we're dealing with, we may be able to identify that as specific niche markets that we're going to focus on. If we move to the airport model, then what we've got is we've got a relatively high adoption of the Strategic Catalyst model, but there's a low adoption of the Virtual Strategy Lab. And so it's good news that people like the Catalyst model, but it's bad news that they expect us to be at their location. So what that would mean for us as we developed our plan is that we would specifically focus on those companies that are local so that we don't have to be traveling all the time. So our customers would probably be local customers to the extent that we can make that happen. As we move to the zooming model, now we've got the case where there's, the good news is people are adopting the Virtual Strategy Lab, but there aren't many people that are doing it because the whole adoption rate of Strategic Catalyst is low. So in this case, again, we're dealing with identifying the niches that are adopting this. So we have to quickly identify who those are, and that's where we're going to focus our attention from a customer acquisition perspective. And then from a booming perspective, this is where there's a high adoption rate of the Strategic Catalyst model, a high adoption rate of Virtual Strategy Labs. There's probably a lot of opportunities, more opportunities out there than we would that we really would want to go after. And so in this case, we can effectively pick and choose. So we don't want to be totally wide open. We want to be selective. We want to focus our efforts in the right ways to get the greatest impact. And so we would be picking and choosing the types of opportunities we want to go after. And that may be geographic based, that might be industry based, that might be types of strategy based. But we would narrow in and really pick and choose those that are going to be most attractive to us with all things considered. Okay, we could continue on. I want to do just one more step to this, and you kind of are getting the sense for it. But this is an important one. What capabilities are important in each of these 4 scenarios? I'm going to jump over to this side because I'm probably blocking your view of some of that table. So what are the capabilities that are going to be essential in each of these 4 different scenarios? Well, if we're going back, if it's really the traditional consulting model that's going to be the winner, then probably the biggest capability to have is a project management capability. This is your traditional big project consulting engagement. And so that capability is an important one to have. We have that to some extent. We certainly would want to strengthen that. If we're now kind of focusing on local customers, and this is where we've got a relatively high adoption level of the Strategic Catalyst model, but not the virtual. Now we're gonna probably be focused very much on developing our sales capabilities, because we're going to have a lot of short-term engagements. So we're going to be out there hustling, and we're probably going to be focused on the local market. So we need to be working to reach out to those local companies and sell them on this new model and sell them on engagements. When we go to Zooming, what we're probably going to have to become really strong at from a capabilities perspective is identifying and implementing off-the-shelf tools. So off-the-shelf technology, off-the-shelf tools. So we might be using, and the reason for this again is that we're talking about a relatively low level of engagement. We can't afford to invest in custom-made tools. So we're probably going to use things like Zoom, like Skype, or whatever the right tools are. And then also tools like maybe Google Docs or other shared documents, Office 365. So we're gonna figure out how to use those off-the-shelf tools to deliver the virtual strategy lab to the relatively limited number of customers that have bought in to this strategic catalyst model. And then in the booming scenario, what's going to set us apart is if we create a virtual strategy lab capability. And so that's something that we're currently working on, and that capability will become essential if this is the scenario that plays out. And so that's a capability that I think is very important to have. So this gives you a sense for kind of how to build that narrative. These are just a table comparing them. You would turn these again into paragraphs and pages that people could read and get a sense for. It's kind of like almost like science fiction in a way of you're saying, if this is the future that plays out, this is what it would look like. This is who would dominate the industry. This is who would be struggling. These are the customers that we'd go after. These are the capabilities that we need to build if we're going to be successful in that future. And you could go on. You can imagine different things. What would our organizational structure need to be like? What are the key people we need to hire? You could again continue on and build that out further. So the last step I'm not going to do on this video, but I think it starts to become somewhat obvious from this discussion, which is now you go through and you start to say, okay, now that we understand the narrative for each of these scenarios, what do the plans look like? And especially importantly, how are the plans different one from another? The capabilities is a key driver of a lot of those plans, but also the customers. And that turns into a go-to-market strategy and a sales strategy, a channel strategy. There's probably product strategies in here as well. So what are the plans that flow if each of these scenarios is what's going to happen? So I've run through this. I haven't looked at the clock, so I don't know how long it is, but we've been going for a while, and I think that at this point, I think hopefully you've got a sense for what it takes to do scenario analysis, and the example that I've used hopefully has been very helpful to you. But let me wrap it up, and I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your attention. Again, my name is Russ McGuire. I'm the founder and chief strategist of SDG Strategy. We are a strategic catalyst, and we help organizations like yours to rapidly develop strategies that are effective and productive, and that can have strong consensus and can be communicated well. And we'd love to help you. We publish information like this freely on the internet at our website, clearpurpose.media. But if you want to reach out to us, our website is sdgstrategy.com, and my email address is russ@sdgstrategy.com. Again, thank you for your time and for your attention, and I hope you have a great day. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.